Alaska's frozen highways stretch endlessly through some of the most isolated wilderness on Earth. Mile after mile of ice-covered asphalt cuts through forests where daylight barely penetrates, across tundra where the wind never stops howling, and over mountain passes where one wrong turn means disappearing forever into the white void. For the brave souls who make their living hauling freight across these desolate roads, every journey is a gamble with forces far beyond their control. But sometimes those forces aren't entirely natural. Tonight, we're diving deep into 10 terrifying encounters experienced by truck drivers navigating Alaska's most haunted highways. These aren't urban legends passed down through generations. These are first-hand accounts from men and women who've stared into the abyss of Alaska's supernatural darkness and lived to tell about it. Some barely escaped with their sanity intact. Others weren't quite so fortunate. So dim the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about what lurks in the Alaskan wilderness after dark. The Dalton Highway stretches 414 miles of pure desolation from Fairbanks to Prudhoe Bay, earning its nickname as one of the world's most dangerous roads. Truckers call it the Haul Road, and for good reason. It's where careers are made and destroyed, where fortunes are won and lives are lost, and where the line between reality and nightmare becomes impossibly thin. Marcus Chun had been running freight up the Dalton for 8 years when he encountered something that made him question everything he thought he knew about that godforsaken stretch of ice and gravel. It was February 2019, deep in the heart of Alaska's brutal winter, when temperatures regularly dropped to 40 below and the aurora borealis painted the sky in otherworldly greens and purples. Marcus was hauling a load of drill pipe from Fairbanks to Deadhorse, a routine run he'd made hundreds of times before. His Peterbilt 379 was running smooth, the engine purring despite the bitter cold that made metal brittle and rubber crack like glass. He'd left Fairbanks at 4 in the afternoon, hoping to make good time before the weather turned even worse. The forecast called for a blizzard by midnight, and Marcus knew better than to get caught in a whiteout on the Dalton. The first 100 miles passed without incident. Marcus kept his CB radio tuned to Channel 19, listening to the sparse chatter from other drivers brave enough to be out in these conditions. The conversations were brief and professional. Location updates, weather reports, road conditions ahead. Nobody wasted words on the Dalton Highway. Every breath spent talking was energy better saved for staying alive. As darkness settled over the tundra like a suffocating blanket, Marcus noticed his headlights picking up something unusual in the distance. At first, he thought it was just another truck, maybe running without a full load of lights to conserve his electrical system. But as he drew closer, the silhouette became clearer, and Marcus felt the first stirring of unease in his gut. The truck ahead was old. Not just old, but ancient by modern standards. It looked like something from the 1940s or 1950s, with a high, boxy cab and rounded fenders that belonged to a different era entirely. The exhaust stack was belching black smoke that seemed to hang in the frigid air longer than physics should have allowed. But what really caught Marcus's attention was the complete absence of lights. No taillights, no running lights, no reflectors. Just a dark mass moving steadily north at exactly the same speed Marcus was traveling. He tried raising the mystery driver on the CB, cycling through all 40 channels. Nothing but static answered back. Marcus increased his speed slightly, hoping to pass the antique rig and get a better look at whoever was crazy enough to run the Dalton in a museum piece without proper lighting. But no matter how much he pushed his Peterbilt, he couldn't seem to close the distance. The old truck stayed exactly the same distance ahead, matching his speed with supernatural precision. That's when Marcus noticed there were more of them. His headlights revealed a second truck ahead of the first, then a third, and a fourth. All of them were the same vintage, all running dark, all moving in perfect formation through the Alaskan night. Marcus counted 8 trucks total, arranged in a convoy that belonged to a time when Eisenhower was president and Alaska wasn't even a state yet. The temperature gauge on Marcus's dashboard began climbing toward the red zone, even though the outside air was cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. His hands started shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. Something was very, very wrong with this picture, and every instinct Marcus had developed in 8 years of long-haul driving was screaming at him to get as far away from this phantom convoy as possible. He tried to slow down, to let the mysterious trucks pull ahead and disappear into the darkness. But his speedometer needle stayed locked at exactly 65 miles per hour, no matter how much pressure he applied to the brake pedal. His truck was maintaining perfect formation with the convoy ahead, as if some invisible force had taken control of his vehicle and was dragging him along for the ride. The CB radio crackled to life, and Marcus nearly jumped out of his skin. But instead of a driver's voice, what came through the speaker was something that sounded like wind howling through empty spaces, punctuated by what might have been voices speaking in a language Marcus didn't recognize. The sound made his teeth ache and sent ice water flowing through his veins. He reached for the radio with a trembling hand, intending to switch it off, but before he could touch the dial, the voices stopped. In the sudden silence, Marcus could hear something that made his blood freeze solid in his arteries. From somewhere ahead in the convoy, barely audible over the rumble of diesel engines, came the unmistakable sound of men screaming. Not shouting or calling out, but screaming in pure animalistic terror. The screams went on for what felt like hours, but probably lasted only seconds. When they finally faded away, Marcus found himself completely alone on the Dalton Highway. The phantom convoy had vanished as if it had never existed at all. His speedometer needle dropped back to normal, his temperature gauge settled into the green zone, and his CB radio returned to its usual background static. Marcus pulled over at the next turnout and sat there shaking for 20 minutes, trying to process what he'd just experienced. He'd been driving truck for most of his adult life, and he'd seen plenty of strange things on the road. Mirages in the desert, weird lights in the sky, optical illusions created by fatigue and long miles. But this had been different. This had been real in a way that defied rational explanation. When he finally worked up the nerve to continue north, Marcus drove the rest of the way to Deadhorse in complete silence, afraid to turn on his CB radio or even his music system. Every shadow on the road ahead looked like it might be another truck from that impossible convoy. Every sound his engine made seemed to echo with the memory of those terrible screams. It wasn't until he reached Prudhoe Bay and checked in with the loading supervisor that Marcus learned something that sent fresh chills racing down his spine. The supervisor, a grizzled veteran of 30 years in the oil fields, listened to Marcus's story with the expression of someone who'd heard similar tales before. "You saw the lost convoy," the supervisor said matter-of-factly, as if he was discussing the weather. "Happens maybe once or twice a year. Usually to drivers running solo in the dead of winter." According to local legend, the phantom convoy consisted of 8 trucks that had attempted to make an emergency supply run during the brutal winter of 1967. A sudden blizzard had caught them somewhere between Fairbanks and the Arctic Circle, and all 8 rigs had simply disappeared. Search teams found no trace of the trucks or their drivers, despite weeks of searching. The official report blamed the harsh conditions and suggested the convoy had gone through thin ice on one of the river crossings. But the searchers never found so much as a bent fender or a fuel spill. "Some folks say they're still trying to complete their delivery," the supervisor explained. "Still running north, still fighting that same blizzard from 52 years ago. And sometimes, when conditions are just right, they'll let a living driver tag along for part of the journey." Marcus wanted to laugh it off as frontier superstition, but he couldn't shake the memory of those screams. Were they the voices of the original drivers, trapped forever in their ghostly vehicles, reliving their final moments over and over again? Or were they something else entirely, something that had been waiting in the Arctic darkness long before the first truck ever rolled north on the Dalton Highway. He never found out, and to this day, Marcus refuses to drive the Dalton Highway alone during the winter months. Some mysteries he learned are better left unsolved. But late at night, when the wind is howling outside his house in Anchorage, Marcus sometimes thinks he can still hear those phantom engines rumbling somewhere in the distance, carrying their doomed cargo through an endless Alaskan winter that will never end. Every truck driver who's spent time on Alaska's winter roads has a story about something that followed them through the darkness. Most of these tales get dismissed as exhaustion-induced hallucinations or tricks of light on ice-covered pavement. But Danny Kowalski's experience on the Elliott Highway in March 2020 was witnessed by his dash cam, recorded by his GPS system, and documented by the Alaska State Troopers in a report that remains classified to this day. Danny had been hauling freight between Fairbanks and Manly Hot Springs for 3 years, making the 160-mile round trip twice a week during the winter months when the mining camps needed regular supply runs. The Elliott Highway was no joke even under the best conditions, winding through dense forests and across frozen rivers where a mechanical breakdown could mean death by exposure. But Danny was experienced, cautious, and equipped with the best cold weather gear money could buy. It was a Tuesday night when everything went sideways. Danny was loaded heavy with mining equipment and fuel, heading west out of Fairbanks under a clear sky lit by a full moon that turned the snow-covered landscape into a scene from a fairy tale. The temperature was holding steady at 22 below, cold enough to be dangerous but not catastrophic. Danny had made this run in much worse conditions. The first sign that something was wrong came about 50 miles out of Fairbanks, near the village of Livingood. Danny's CB radio started picking up transmissions on Channel 19, which was unusual since he was the only truck on the road that night. The voice was male, middle-aged, and spoke with the flat accent of someone who'd spent his whole life in Alaska. Eastbound truck approaching mile marker 51. You got your ears on? Danny keyed his mic. Yeah, I got you. This is the westbound Peterbilt just past Livingood. You running loaded or empty tonight? Running empty back to Fairbanks. How's the road ahead looking? Smooth and clear. Little slick in places, but nothing to worry about. What's your 20? There was a long pause before the voice came back. About 5 miles ahead of you. I'll be looking for your headlights. Danny strained to see ahead through his windshield, but the road was empty except for the tunnel of light created by his headlamps. The Elliott Highway was arrow straight for miles in this section, with clear visibility for at least 2 miles ahead. If there was another truck 5 miles up the road, Danny should have been able to see his lights. I'm not seeing you yet, Danny transmitted. You sure about your location? Positive. I'm right here waiting for you. A chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature crept up Danny's spine. He'd been driving truck long enough to know that something was off about this conversation. The voice on the radio was too calm, too casual for a driver running alone on one of Alaska's most isolated highways in the middle of the night. And there was something else, something Danny couldn't quite put his finger on. The voice sounded familiar, like someone he'd met before but couldn't quite place. Danny continued west, maintaining his speed but staying alert for any sign of the mystery truck. His dash cam was recording everything, and his GPS unit was tracking his exact position and speed. Whatever happened next, there would be a record of it. 5 minutes later, Danny crested a small hill and saw headlights in his mirrors. Not ahead of him where the other driver claimed to be, but behind him, closing fast. The approaching truck was running with full high beams, turning Danny's side mirrors into blazing white rectangles that made it impossible to see anything else. Hey, eastbound truck behind me, Danny called on the radio. You're lighting me up pretty good with those high beams. How about dimming them down? The response came immediately, in the same calm voice from before. "Sorry about that, brother. These old lights don't dim too well." Danny adjusted his mirrors to deflect the glare and tried to get a better look at the approaching vehicle. What he saw made his mouth go dry. The truck behind him wasn't just old, it was ancient. The headlights were round and mounted high on the fenders, the kind of setup that hadn't been used since the 1960s. The cab was tall and boxy, with a flat windshield that reflected the moonlight like a mirror. It looked like something that belonged in a museum, not on a modern highway. "What kind of rig you running there?" Danny asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Old Ford Louisville. She's been good to me for a lot of years." Danny's blood turned to slush. Ford had stopped making the Louisville model in 1998, and even the newest ones were now more than 20 years old. But the truck behind him didn't just look old. It looked like it had rolled off the assembly line in 1975. The chrome was too bright, the paint too fresh, and the exhaust smoke was the thick black cloud that only came from engines built before emissions standards existed. The mystery truck began to close the distance between them, despite Danny maintaining a steady 60 miles per hour. In his side mirror, Danny could see the driver's silhouette behind the wheel, but the details were wrong. The figure seemed too tall, too thin, and its movements were too fluid for someone fighting the fatigue and stiffness that came with long hours on the road. "You mind if I pass?" the voice asked over the radio. "I'm running behind schedule." "Go ahead," Danny replied, though every instinct he had was screaming at him to speed up, to keep the mystery truck behind him where he could see it. The old Ford pulled into the left lane and began to overtake Danny's Peterbilt. As it drew alongside, Danny got his first clear look at the driver, and what he saw made him question his sanity. The man behind the wheel was pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow with their own internal light. His mouth was moving as if he was speaking, but no words were coming through the CB radio. Worse yet, Danny could see straight through the driver's cab to the passenger side door. The truck was there, solid and real enough to cast shadows on the snow-covered pavement, but the man driving it was something else entirely. The phantom truck completed its pass and settled into the right lane ahead of Danny, maintaining the same steady speed. Danny tried to increase his following distance, but every time he slowed down, the ghost truck slowed down too, staying exactly 50 yards ahead. When Danny sped up, so did his supernatural escort. "This is getting real weird," Danny muttered to himself, reaching for his cell phone to call the state troopers. But the phone showed no signal, which was impossible. The Elliott Highway had cell coverage for most of its length, and Danny had made calls from this exact location dozens of times before. The CB radio crackled back to life. "You're doing good, Danny. Just keep following me and everything will be fine." Danny's blood froze. He'd never given the mystery driver his name. "How do you know my name?" Danny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know a lot of things, Danny. I know you've got a wife named Sarah and 2 kids back in Fairbanks. I know you're worried about making the payments on that new truck. I know you take this route twice a week, every week, no matter what the weather's doing." The level of personal detail was terrifying. Danny had never talked to this driver before, had never even seen the antique Ford Louisville on any of his previous runs. But somehow, the ghostly figure behind the wheel knew everything about Danny's life, his family, his fears. "Who are you?" Danny managed to ask. "I'm someone who used to drive this route, back when the Elliott was just a gravel road and Fairbanks was half the size it is now. I had a wife and kids too. Had a truck I was proud of and a future I was working toward." The phantom truck began to slow down, forcing Danny to reduce his speed as well. They were approaching a section of road where the highway crossed a frozen creek, one of dozens of water crossings that made the Elliott so dangerous in winter. The ice looked solid, but appearances could be deceiving. Every year, Vehicles broke through what looked like safe ice and disappeared into the dark water below. "What happened to you?" Danny asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. March 15, 1983. Late-season blizzard caught me right here at this crossing. Ice was thinner than it looked, went through like it was paper, and the current carried me and my rig downstream. Took them 3 weeks to find my body, and they never did recover the truck. Danny's dashboard GPS showed the date as March 15, 2020, exactly 37 years to the day since the phantom driver's death. As they approached the creek crossing, the ghost truck began to fade, becoming more and more transparent until Danny could see the road right through it. The driver's voice came through the CB one last time, fainter now and filled with an infinite sadness. "Don't end up like me, Danny. Drive careful, drive safe, and always check the ice twice before you trust it with your life. Some mistakes you don't get to learn from." The Phantom Ford Louisville disappeared completely just as Danny's truck reached the edge of the creek crossing. He stopped and got out to inspect the ice, using his flashlight and ice probe to test its thickness. What he found made his knees weak. The ice was barely 4 inches thick, nowhere near strong enough to support the weight of a loaded semi-truck. If he'd crossed at his normal speed without stopping to check, he would have gone through the surface and joined the phantom driver at the bottom of the creek. Danny called for a state plow truck to spread sand and salt on an alternate route, adding 6 hours to his delivery time but potentially saving his life. When the troopers arrived to investigate his report, they found the dash cam footage showing the phantom truck, the GPS records documenting the impossible conversation, and the CB radio logs proving that Danny had been talking to someone who'd been dead for 37 years. But most disturbing of all, they found tire tracks in the snow leading right up to the edge of the creek crossing, tracks that matched the wheel pattern of a 1970s Ford Louisville. The tracks ended at the water's edge and didn't continue on the other side, as if the truck that made them had simply vanished into the frozen creek below. Danny still drives the Elliott Highway, but he's never made another run on March 15th. And every time he passes that creek crossing, he slows down, checks his mirrors, and listens to his CB radio for the voice of a dead man who's still trying to save the lives of the living, one driver at a time. The George Parks Highway connects Anchorage to Fairbanks across 358 miles of some of Alaska's most breathtaking and treacherous terrain. It's a road that demands respect, where weather conditions can change from clear to life-threatening in a matter of minutes, and where the margin for error shrinks to nothing when temperatures drop and daylight disappears for months at a time. Rebecca Martinez had been running freight on the Parks Highway for 6 years, when she encountered something that fundamentally changed her understanding of what was possible in the Alaskan wilderness. It was November 2021, during the darkest time of year when sunrise didn't happen until almost 10 in the morning and sunset came before 4 in the afternoon. Rebecca was hauling a load of construction materials from Anchorage to Fairbanks, making good time on roads that were clear and dry despite the bitter cold. Rebecca drove a custom-built Kenworth W900L that she'd purchased used from a driver who'd retired after 30 years on Alaska's highways. The previous owner, an old-timer named Frank Kowalski, had warned her that the truck had peculiarities, but had never elaborated on what those might be. The rig ran perfectly, got good fuel mileage, and had never left Rebecca stranded. So she dismissed Frank's cryptic warnings as the superstitions of an aging driver who'd spent too many years on the road alone. She was halfway between Wasilla and Talkeetna, running through a section of highway bordered by dense spruce forest, when she first heard the voices. They came through her CB radio as faint whispers, barely audible over the static and the rumble of her engine. At first, Rebecca thought she was picking up a distant conversation from truckers hundreds of miles away, a common phenomenon when atmospheric conditions were just right. But as she listened more carefully, the whispers became clearer, and Rebecca realized they weren't speaking English. The language was something she'd never heard before, with harsh consonants and flowing vowels that seemed to echo strangely through her cab. The voices sounded urgent, almost desperate, as if they were trying to communicate something of vital importance. Rebecca tried adjusting her CB radio, cycling through all 40 channels, but the whispers followed her to every frequency. They grew stronger as she drove north, becoming more insistent and more clearly defined. Soon she could distinguish individual voices, at least a dozen of them, all speaking at once in that strange, haunting language. The temperature gauge on Rebecca's dashboard began to fluctuate wildly, swinging from normal to overheating and back again without any apparent cause. Her fuel gauge started dropping faster than it should have, as if something was draining extra power from her electrical system. Most disturbing of all, her GPS unit began showing impossible readings, indicating that she was driving through areas where no roads existed, across terrain that consisted of nothing but wilderness and frozen swampland. Rebecca pulled over at a rest area near mile marker 200, hoping to figure out what was wrong with her truck's electronics. The moment she shut off her engine, the whispers stopped, and an eerie silence settled over the forest around her. The only sounds were the ticking of cooling metal and the wind moving through the spruce trees, but even the wind sounded wrong somehow, as if it was carrying voices from somewhere far away. She popped the hood and checked her electrical connections, but everything looked normal. The alternator was charging properly, the battery voltage was stable, and all the fuses were intact. Rebecca had been around trucks long enough to diagnose most mechanical problems, but whatever was affecting her rig wasn't showing up on any conventional diagnostics. When she climbed back into the cab and started her engine, the whispers returned immediately, louder now and more insistent than before. Rebecca tried to ignore them, focusing on the road ahead and the familiar rhythm of shifting gears and monitoring gauges. But the voices seemed to be getting inside her head, making it difficult to concentrate on driving. That's when she noticed the hitchhiker. The figure was standing beside the highway about a quarter-mile ahead, barely visible in the sweep of her headlights. At first glance, it looked like a person in heavy winter clothing, the kind of gear that anyone would wear to survive outside in temperatures that were hovering around 30 below zero. But as Rebecca got closer, details became apparent that made her blood run cold. The hitchhiker was too tall, nearly 8 feet from head to foot. Its arms were too long, hanging down past where its knees should be. The winter clothing wasn't clothing at all, but rather what looked like animal fur that grew directly from its skin. And worst of all, it had no face. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, white flesh that gleamed in the moonlight like polished bone. Rebecca's first instinct was to accelerate past the creature and put as much distance between herself and whatever it was as possible. But when she pressed down on the gas pedal, her truck began to slow down instead of speeding up. The engine was running smoothly, but it was as if some invisible force was dragging against her wheels, pulling her toward the side of the road where the faceless hitchhiker waited. The CB radio crackled with static, and through the white noise, Rebecca heard a single word spoken in clear, unaccented English: "Stop." Rebecca fought against whatever was controlling her truck, but it was useless. Her Kenworth rolled to a halt directly beside the impossible figure standing in the snow. Up close, the thing was even more terrifying than it had appeared from a distance. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, with limbs that were too long and jointed in places where no joints should exist. The fur covering its body was matted and filthy, as if it had been living in the wilderness for decades. And that smooth, featureless face turned toward Rebecca's cab with an intelligence that was definitely not human. The creature raised one impossibly long arm and placed what might have been a hand against Rebecca's driver's side window. The glass immediately fogged over with ice crystals, but Rebecca could see dark impressions forming in the frost, shapes that looked almost like letters or symbols from some ancient alphabet. The whispers on her CB radio became a roar, dozens of voices all speaking at once in that harsh, unknown language. But now Rebecca could understand them, as if the creature's touch on her window had given her the ability to translate what they were saying. They were warnings. The voices belonged to drivers who had traveled this highway over the decades, truckers who had encountered the faceless hitchhiker and never made it to their destinations. They were trapped somehow, their spirits bound to the creature that had claimed their lives, forced to watch as it stalked new victims along the park's highway. "Don't get out," the voices pleaded. "Don't open the door. Don't let it inside." But even as Rebecca listened to their warnings, she felt an overwhelming urge to unlock her cab and invite the creature in. The compulsion was so strong it was almost physical, like invisible hands trying to force her to reach for the door handle. The thing outside her window was doing something to her mind, bending her will to its own purposes. Rebecca bit down hard on her tongue, using the sharp pain to focus her thoughts. She remembered Frank Kowalski's warnings about the truck's peculiarities and wondered if the old driver had encountered this same creature during his 30 years on Alaska's highways. Maybe the whispers she'd been hearing weren't coming through her CB radio at all, but were actually the voices of previous owners trying to protect her from something that hunted along this stretch of road. The creature began to press harder against her window, and Rebecca could see hairline cracks starting to form in the safety glass. In a few more seconds, it would break through, and she would be face to face with whatever this thing really was. But Rebecca had one advantage that its previous victims might not have had. She understood what was happening, and she knew she had to act fast. Rebecca threw her transmission into gear and floored the accelerator. Her truck lurched forward, throwing the creature off balance and sending it stumbling backward into the snow. In her side mirror, Rebecca could see the thing standing in the middle of the highway, watching her drive away with that eyeless, featureless face turned in her direction. The whispers on her CB radio began to fade as she put distance between herself and the hitchhiker. But before they disappeared completely, Rebecca heard one final message in English, spoken in what sounded like Frank Kowalski's voice. "You did good, kid. Drive safe, and don't ever stop for anything on this stretch of road, no matter how human it looks." Rebecca drove the rest of the way to Fairbanks without stopping, not even for fuel or food. When she finally reached her destination and began unloading her cargo, she discovered something that made her knees weak. Pressed into the metal of her driver's side door were 5 distinct impressions, each one shaped like a human handprint but far too large to have been made by any normal person. The marks were burned into the steel as if they'd been made with a branding iron, and they radiated a cold that had nothing to do with Alaska's winter temperatures. No amount of scrubbing or sanding could remove them, and they remained visible on Rebecca's truck for the rest of her driving career, a permanent reminder of her encounter with something that should not exist. Rebecca still runs the park's highway, but she's modified her route to avoid that particular rest area near mile marker 200, and she's installed extra CB radios in her cab, tuned to frequencies that most drivers never monitor, so she can listen for the whispers that might warn her about dangers ahead. Because sometimes, the voices of the dead are the only things standing between the living and horrors that hunt in Alaska's endless winter darkness. The Richardson Highway holds the distinction of being Alaska's first major road, a 366-mile ribbon of asphalt that connects Valdez to Fairbanks through some of the state's most remote and unforgiving terrain. It's a road that demands respect, where weather conditions can change from clear to life-threatening in a matter of minutes, and where the margin for error shrinks to nothing when temperatures drop and daylight disappears for months at a time. Tommy Nakamura had been driving the Richardson for 12 years, hauling everything from fuel to food supplies to the remote communities scattered along its length. He knew every curve, every grade, every dangerous stretch where ice formed in shadows that never saw sunlight even during the summer months. Tommy was the kind of driver who other truckers respected, someone who'd earned his reputation through years of safe, professional operation in conditions that would terrify most people. It was January 2022 when Tommy's understanding of the Richardson Highway changed forever. He was northbound from Valdez with a load of heating oil destined for a mining camp near Fairbanks, making good time despite temperatures that had dropped to 45 below zero. The weather was clear, with stars so bright they seemed close enough to reach up and touch, and Tommy was enjoying one of those rare nights when everything felt perfect on the road. The first sign that something was wrong came around 2 in the morning, about 30 miles south of Glen Ellen. Tommy noticed movement in his peripheral vision, shadows flitting between the snow-covered spruce trees that lined the highway. At first, he assumed he was seeing caribou or moose, common sights along the stretch of road. But the shadows were moving wrong, too fast and too fluid for any animal he'd ever encountered. Tommy slowed his rig and focused his attention on the tree line, trying to get a better look at whatever was pacing him through the forest. What he saw made him question his eyesight and his sanity. The shadows weren't animals at all, but humanoid figures that seemed to glide between the trees without touching the ground. They were tall and impossibly thin, with elongated limbs that moved in ways that defied human anatomy. But the most disturbing aspect of these shadow figures was their faces, or rather, the complete absence of faces. Where features should have been, there was only a void so complete that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Looking at them was like staring into holes cut in the fabric of reality itself. Tommy tried to convince himself that he was experiencing some form of highway hypnosis, a common phenomenon among long-haul drivers who spent too many hours staring at endless stretches of road. But the shadow figures were becoming more numerous and more active, emerging from the forest to stand beside the highway and watch his truck pass. Some of them seemed to be gesturing, pointing at Tommy's cab with arms that were far too long for their bodies. The CB radio in Tommy's truck began to emit strange sounds. Not quite static, but not quite voices either. The noise was rhythmic and pulsing, almost like a heartbeat, and it seemed to synchronize with the movements of the shadow figures outside his windows. Tommy tried changing channels, but the bizarre audio followed him to every frequency, growing stronger and more insistent with each passing mile. As Tommy approached the Copper River Bridge, a notorious trouble spot where high winds and icy conditions had claimed numerous vehicles over the years, the shadow figures began to congregate more densely along the roadside. They seemed to be waiting for something, standing in perfect stillness despite the brutal wind that was howling across the river valley. Tommy's truck started to buffet in the crosswind, requiring all his attention to keep it on the road and prevent it from being blown into the guardrail. That's when he saw the accident. About half a mile ahead, emergency lights were flashing on the bridge. Tommy could see the distinctive red and blue strobes of police cars and ambulances, along with the yellow warning lights of a highway department vehicle. As he got closer, the scene became clearer. A semi-truck had jackknifed on the icy bridge deck, blocking both lanes of traffic. Emergency workers were directing traffic around the accident scene, using the narrow shoulder to squeeze vehicles past the wreckage. Tommy began to slow his rig, preparing to navigate carefully around the disabled truck. But as he got within a few hundred yards of the accident scene, something impossible happened. The emergency vehicles simply vanished, disappearing as if they had never been there at all. The wreckage was gone, the flashing lights were gone, and the bridge was completely clear of any obstruction. Tommy slammed on his brakes, bringing his truck to a complete stop in the middle of the highway. He sat there for several minutes, staring at the empty bridge and trying to process what he'd just witnessed. The accident scene had been absolutely real, complete with every detail he would have expected to see. He'd even been able to make out individual emergency workers moving around the crash site. But now there was nothing there except wind-swept asphalt and blowing snow. The shadow figures had vanished as well, leaving Tommy completely alone on the Richardson Highway. The strange sounds from his CB radio had stopped, replaced by the normal background static that he'd grown accustomed to over years of long-distance driving. Everything seemed to have returned to normal, but Tommy knew that what he'd experienced was anything but normal. He drove across the bridge slowly and carefully, half expecting to encounter some trace of the accident he'd witnessed. But there was no debris, no skid marks, no indication that anything unusual had happened on this stretch of road. Tommy continued north toward Fairbanks, but his mind was racing with questions that had no rational answers. It wasn't until he reached his destination and began unloading his cargo that Tommy learned something that sent ice water flowing through his veins. The loading dock supervisor, a longtime resident of the area who knew every driver who regularly ran the Richardson, mentioned that Tommy looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Funny you should say that," Tommy replied, and he told the supervisor about his encounter with the shadow figures and the phantom accident scene. The supervisor's expression grew serious as Tommy described what he'd witnessed. "You saw them near the Copper River Bridge?" "Right at the bridge." "Why, have other drivers reported seeing those shadow things?" "More than you might think. And the accident scene you described sounds exactly like what happened there in March of 1987. Semi-truck carrying diesel fuel jackknifed on the bridge during a windstorm. The impact ruptured the fuel tank, and the truck caught fire. By the time emergency crews arrived, the driver was dead and half the bridge deck was damaged." Tommy felt the blood drain from his face. What was the driver's name? The supervisor checked his records and came back with information that made Tommy's knees weak. The driver who had died in the 1987 accident was named Marcus Chen, and he'd been driving the same route that Tommy had just completed, carrying the same type of cargo to the same destination. "Here's the thing that's really going to mess with your head," the supervisor continued. "The accident happened on January 23, 1987, exactly 35 years ago tonight." Tommy looked at his watch and saw that it was now past 3 in the morning on January 24th. He'd encountered the phantom accident scene at the exact time and location where Marcus Chen had died 3.5 decades earlier. But the supervisor wasn't finished with his revelations. "The shadow figures you saw have been reported by drivers for as long as anyone can remember. Native tribes in this area have legends about dark spirits that hunt along the old trails, entities that feed on the life force of travelers who venture into their territory alone. They say these spirits can show you visions of the past and future, scenes of accidents that have happened or are yet to happen." Tommy never learned whether the accident scene he'd witnessed was a replay of Marcus Chen's fatal crash or a warning about some future tragedy. But he made sure to schedule his runs so that he never again drove past the Copper River Bridge during the early morning hours of January 23rd. Some anniversaries, he decided, were better left unobserved. And whenever Tommy talks to other drivers about his experience on the Richardson Highway, he always ends with the same warning. If you see shadow figures watching you from the tree line, and if your CB radio starts making sounds that don't belong in this world, pull over immediately and wait for daylight. Because the spirits that hunt along Alaska's oldest highway are always hungry, and they're always looking for the next traveler who might not be lucky enough to make it home. The Seward Highway is considered one of the most scenic drives in North America, winding through the Chugach Mountains and along the shores of Tinigan Arm with views that can take your breath away even on the clearest days. But beauty in Alaska often comes with danger, and the Seward Highway has claimed more lives per mile than almost any other road in the state. Avalanches, ice, wildlife encounters, and sudden weather changes make every journey a calculated risk. What most drivers don't know about the Seward Highway is that it contains a mile that doesn't officially exist, a stretch of road that appears and disappears according to laws that have nothing to do with highway engineering or geographic reality. Local truckers call it the Vanishing Mile, and those who've encountered it describe an experience that challenges everything they thought they knew about the physical world. Jennifer Walsh had been running freight between Anchorage and Seward for 8 years when she first drove the Vanishing Mile. It was October 2020, during that liminal time of year when Alaska balanced precariously between autumn and winter, when weather conditions could change from mild to deadly in a matter of hours. Jennifer was hauling a load of supplies for the fishing fleet in Seward, making what should have been a routine 2-hour drive through familiar territory. The incident began about 20 miles south of Anchorage, in a section of highway that Jennifer had traveled thousands of times before. She was maintaining a steady 55 miles per hour, well within the speed limit and appropriate for the slightly icy conditions. The sun was setting behind the Chugach Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that made the snow-covered peaks glow like molten metal. Jennifer noticed the mile marker first. Instead of the expected number sequence, the green sign by the roadside read, "Mile -1." She assumed it was a mistake, perhaps a sign that had been installed upside down or damaged by weather. But as she continued south, the next marker read "Mile -2, then "Mile -3, and so on. The mile markers were counting backward, which was impossible according to Alaska's highway numbering system. More disturbing than the backward mile markers was the gradual change in her surroundings. The familiar landscape of the Seward Highway was transforming into something she didn't recognize. The mountains seemed taller and more jagged, with peaks that scraped against storm clouds that hadn't been there minutes before. The vegetation along the roadside was wrong too, consisting of plants that didn't grow in Alaska, twisted trees with black bark and leaves that moved without any wind to disturb them. Jennifer tried to check her location using her GPS unit, but the screen showed only static, as if she'd driven into a dead zone where satellites couldn't penetrate. Her cell phone displayed "no service," which was unusual for this section of the highway. Most concerning of all, her fuel gauge was dropping faster than it should have been, as if the mysterious stretch of road was somehow consuming more energy than normal driving conditions required. The CB radio crackled to life, and Jennifer heard her own voice coming through the speakers. "Northbound truck at mile marker 15. This is the southbound Kenworth. You got your ears on." Jennifer grabbed her microphone, but before she could respond, she heard another voice answer, also unmistakably her own. "Yeah, I got you. Road conditions looking good ahead." Two versions of Jennifer Walsh were having a conversation on Channel 19, discussing road conditions and weather as if they were two different drivers meeting on the highway. But Jennifer was alone in her cab, and she wasn't transmitting anything. Somehow, her CB radio was picking up a conversation she was having with herself, a conversation that seemed to be taking place in the past or future or some parallel version of reality where the Seward Highway operated according to different rules. Jennifer tried turning off her radio, but the voices continued broadcasting, multiple versions of herself discussing various trips she'd made over the years, routes she'd driven, cargo she'd hauled. It was as if every journey she'd ever made on the Seward Highway was happening simultaneously in this impossible stretch of road, overlapping and intersecting in ways that defied linear time. The landscape outside her windows became increasingly surreal. Jennifer passed buildings that had never been constructed, bridges that spanned rivers she'd never seen before, and other vehicles that flickered in and out of existence like mirages on hot asphalt. Some of the other trucks looked familiar, rigs she'd seen in truck stops and rest areas over the years, but they were translucent, barely visible against the darkening sky. Then Jennifer saw something that made her slam on her brakes so hard that her trailer tires locked up and began smoking. Ahead of her on the highway, maybe a quarter-mile distant, was her own truck. Not a similar Kenworth, but her exact rig, complete with the custom paint job and the distinctive chrome modifications she'd spent years perfecting. The other version of her truck was traveling in the same direction, maintaining the same speed, carrying what appeared to be an identical load. Jennifer accelerated, trying to catch up with her doppelganger. But no matter how fast she drove, the distance between the two trucks remained constant, as if she was chasing her own reflection in a funhouse mirror that stretched for miles. She could see herself in the cab of the other truck, hands on the wheel, eyes focused on the road ahead, completely unaware that she was being followed by another version of herself. The CB radio chatter intensified, with dozens of Jennifer Walshes discussing their various experiences on the Seward Highway. Some were describing trips she'd already made. Others were talking about routes she'd never driven but somehow knew she would drive in the future. It was like listening to every possible version of her trucking career playing out simultaneously, a cacophony of parallel lives all existing in the same impossible space. Jennifer's fuel gauge hit the quarter tank mark, which should have been impossible given that she'd started the trip with a full tank and had only been driving for 45 minutes. But time itself seemed to be behaving strangely in the vanishing mile. Her dashboard clock was spinning forward and backward randomly, and the sky outside was cycling through different phases of daylight and darkness, as if entire days were passing in minutes. That's when Jennifer realized what she had to do. She needed to stop chasing her other self and find a way out of this temporal loop before she became permanently trapped in a stretch of highway that existed outside normal reality. Jennifer began looking for an exit, a side road, anything that might lead back to the familiar version of the Seward Highway she knew. She found it at mile marker -27, a gravel road that branched off to the east toward what looked like normal Alaskan wilderness. Jennifer took the exit without hesitation, leaving the impossible highway and her phantom double behind. The gravel road was rough and unmarked, winding through dense forest for several miles before eventually reconnecting with the regular Seward Highway at mile marker 78. When Jennifer checked her GPS unit again, it showed her correct location and indicated that she'd somehow skipped 22 miles of highway without any explanation of how such a thing was possible. Her fuel gauge had returned to normal levels, her dashboard clock was keeping proper time, and her CB radio was broadcasting only the usual trucker chatter from drivers on conventional roads. Jennifer completed her delivery in Seward and drove back to Anchorage without incident, but she couldn't stop thinking about her experience in the vanishing mile. She began asking other drivers if they'd ever encountered anything similar on the Seward Highway, and the stories she heard convinced her that she wasn't losing her mind. Over the years, dozens of truckers had reported entering sections of the highway that didn't match their maps, encountering multiple versions of themselves, and experiencing time distortions that seemed to compress or expand their journeys in impossible ways. Some drivers claimed they'd met alternate versions of themselves who'd made different life choices, driving trucks they'd never owned and discussing trips to places they'd never been. The Alaska Department of Transportation has no official record of these incidents, and their maps show no unexplained gaps or anomalies in the Seward Highway's length. But the truckers who've driven the vanishing mile know it exists, hidden somewhere between the normal mile markers, waiting for the right conditions and the right driver to reveal itself once again. Jennifer still runs the Seward Highway regularly, but she's learned to pay close attention to the mile markers and her fuel gauge. And whenever she hears her own voice on the CB radio discussing trips she doesn't remember making, she knows it's time to find the nearest exit and return to a version of reality where the laws of physics still apply. Because in Alaska's endless wilderness, sometimes the road itself becomes lost, carrying travelers into dimensions where past, present, and future exist simultaneously, and where the only way home is to stop trying to understand the impossible and simply focus on finding the way back to the world you came from. The Steese Highway stretches 161 miles from Fairbanks to the tiny community of Circle, following a route that was originally blazed by gold prospectors seeking their fortunes in the Klondike. It's one of Alaska's most remote highways, passing through wilderness so vast and empty that a breakdown can mean death by exposure within hours. The road is officially designated as Alaska Route 6, but locals know it by a different name: the Highway of the Lost. Carl Morrison had been running supplies to mining camps along the Steese for 15 years when he encountered something that made him question whether the boundary between life and death was as absolute as he'd always believed. It was February 2019, during a stretch of weather so brutal that temperatures hadn't risen above -40 degrees in 3 weeks. Carl was hauling mining equipment to a gold operation near Central, making one of his regular runs despite conditions that would have kept most drivers off the road. Carl drove a modified Freightliner Cascadia equipped with every cold weather option available: engine block heaters, auxiliary power units, Arctic-rated tires, and enough survival gear to keep him alive for weeks if his truck broke down in the wilderness. He'd learned long ago that preparation was the difference between coming home safely and becoming another casualty of Alaska's unforgiving winter. The first sign that this trip would be different from his usual runs came at mile marker 42, about halfway to his destination. Carl's headlights picked up what looked like a vehicle pulled over on the shoulder ahead. As he got closer, Carl could see it was an old pickup truck, maybe from the 1980s, with its hood up and steam rising from the engine bay. In temperatures this extreme, a breakdown meant almost certain death unless help arrived quickly. Carl pulled over behind the disabled vehicle and grabbed his emergency kit, including extra clothes, hot coffee from his thermos, and flares to mark the scene. But as he approached the pickup truck, details became apparent that made his blood run cold. The vehicle was covered in ice so thick it looked like it had been sitting in a freezer for months. Icicles hung from the bumper and wheel wells, and the windows were completely opaque with frost. More disturbing was the complete absence of footprints in the snow around the truck. If someone had gotten out to check under the hood, there should have been tracks leading away from the vehicle, evidence that the driver had tried to flag down help or seek shelter. But the snow around the pickup was undisturbed, as if no one had walked there in weeks. Carl knocked on the driver's side window, calling out to ask if anyone needed assistance. The ice covering the glass was so thick he couldn't see inside, but he could make out a dark silhouette behind the wheel. The figure wasn't moving, wasn't responding to Carl's calls, and somehow seemed too small and too still to be a living person. Using his ice scraper, Carl began clearing frost from the side window. What he revealed underneath made him stumble backward in horror. The person behind the wheel was frozen solid, transformed into an ice sculpture that perfectly preserved every detail of their final moments. The man's eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead with an expression of absolute terror. His mouth was open as if he'd been screaming when death claimed him. But the frozen driver wasn't alone. As Carl cleared more ice from the windows, he could see other figures in the pickup truck. 2 more people sat in the cab, all of them preserved in ice, all wearing expressions of terror that suggested they'd seen something horrifying in their final moments. The truck's interior was filled with ice crystals that sparkled like diamonds in Carl's flashlight beam, creating a tomb that was both beautiful and utterly terrifying. Carl backed away from the pickup truck, his mind racing to process what he'd discovered. These people had been dead for a long time, possibly months or even years, but their truck was sitting on the shoulder of a highway that was regularly plowed and patrolled by state maintenance crews. Someone should have found them long before now. That's when Carl noticed there were more vehicles ahead. Stretching along the shoulder of the Steese Highway for as far as his flashlight beam could penetrate, Carl could see the shapes of cars, trucks, and motorcycles, all of them covered in the same thick coating of ice that had preserved the pickup truck and its occupants. Some of the vehicles looked relatively modern, but others appeared to be decades old, relics from an era when the Steese Highway was nothing more than a rough trail used by prospectors and trappers. Carl walked from vehicle to vehicle, using his ice scraper to peer through frozen windows. Every one contained the same horrific scene: perfectly preserved occupants frozen in expressions of terror, their final moments captured in ice like insects trapped in amber. Men, women, children, entire families caught by whatever force had claimed their lives along this desolate stretch of highway. Some of the frozen victims were reaching toward their door handles, as if they'd been trying to escape from their vehicles when death overtook them. Others had their hands pressed against the windows, fingers splayed in desperate attempts to break through the glass that had become their prison walls. All of them wore the same expression of absolute horror, as if they'd seen something in their final moments that was too terrible for the human mind to process. Carl's CB radio crackled to life, and through the static came voices speaking in the flat, emotionless tones of people who had given up all hope. "Help us. We're so cold. We've been waiting so long for someone to find us." The voices were coming from the frozen vehicles around him, impossible transmissions from people who had been dead for years or decades. Carl could see their lips moving behind the ice-covered windows, speaking words that came through his radio with perfect clarity despite the fact that their vocal cords had been frozen solid. "Don't leave us here," the voices pleaded. "We just want to go home. We've been cold for so long." Carl's survival instincts kicked in, overriding his horror and confusion. He ran back to his truck, threw it into gear, and accelerated away from the graveyard of frozen vehicles as fast as the icy road conditions would allow. In his mirrors, he could see dozens of headlights flickering to life behind him, the ghostly vehicles starting their engines and beginning to follow him down the highway. The phantom convoy stayed with Carl for the next 20 miles, matching his speed and maintaining perfect formation despite the fact that their drivers had been dead for decades. Their headlights cast strange shadows on the snow-covered landscape, and their exhaust pipes belched steam that formed impossible shapes in the frigid air, figures that almost looked human before dissolving into the darkness. Carl's radio continued broadcasting the voices of the frozen dead, dozens of them now, all begging for help, all asking to be taken somewhere warm where the ice could finally melt from their bodies. They shared stories of how they died, tales of sudden blizzards, mechanical failures, and encounters with something in the wilderness that had killed them before they could reach safety. "It comes during the worst storms," one voice explained, "when the wind is howling and the snow is so thick you can't see 10 feet ahead. It finds travelers who are alone and afraid, and it feeds on their life force, draining their warmth until they freeze from the inside out." Another voice added, "We've been trying to warn people for years, but nobody listens. They think we're just stories, just legends told by drunk miners in gnome bars. But we're real, and we're still here, still cold, still waiting." The convoy of phantom vehicles followed Carl all the way to Central, but as he pulled into the mining camp, they vanished one by one, their headlights fading like dying stars until only Carl's truck remained on the highway. The voices on his CB radio whispered final farewells before falling silent, leaving Carl alone with the memory of what he'd witnessed and the knowledge that he'd barely escaped becoming another victim of the Steese Highway's supernatural predator. When Carl told his story to the miners at the camp, he learned that similar encounters had been reported for as long as people had been traveling the remote highway. Native tribes in the area spoke of an ancient spirit that hunted during the worst winter storms, a creature of ice and hunger that fed on human warmth and left its victims frozen in place where they died. The Alaska State Troopers had records of dozens of vehicles found along the Steese Highway over the decades, all containing occupants who had apparently frozen to death despite having adequate clothing and functioning heating systems. In every case, the victims wore expressions of terror that suggested they'd seen something horrifying before they died, but investigators could never determine what had frightened them so badly. Carl completed his delivery and made the return trip to Fairbanks during daylight hours, but he could never forget the image of those frozen faces staring out through ice-covered windows. He continued running freight to mining camps along the Steese Highway, but he modified his schedule to avoid traveling during severe weather conditions, when visibility dropped to zero and the temperature fell below the threshold where life and death became separated by the thinnest of margins. And every time Carl drives past mile marker 42, he slows down and checks his CB radio, listening for the voices of the frozen phantoms who are still waiting along the highway of the lost, still hoping that someone will find a way to bring them home from their eternal winter. The top of the World Highway is one of Alaska's most spectacular and dangerous roads, connecting the small town of Chicken to the Canadian border across 79 miles of mountainous terrain that seems to scrape the sky itself. The highway earned its name honestly, winding through peaks that rise over 4,000 feet above sea level and offering views that stretch to the horizon in every direction. But beauty comes with a price on this remote highway, where weather can change from clear to life-threatening in minutes, and where a single mistake can send a vehicle tumbling into ravines thousands of feet deep. What most travelers don't realize about the top of the World Highway is that time itself behaves differently at extreme elevations, especially during certain atmospheric conditions when the aurora borealis interacts with magnetic fields in ways that scientists still don't fully understand. Local drivers have reported experiences that suggest the highway occasionally slips out of normal temporal flow, creating loops and paradoxes that trap travelers in recursive cycles of their own journeys. Maria Santos had been hauling supplies to remote mining operations along the top of the World Highway for 7 years when she became trapped in what she can only describe as a temporal anomaly. It was September 2021, during the brief window when the highway was passable before winter snows made it impassable until the following spring. Maria was driving a loaded Peterbilt 389, carrying drilling equipment to a gold mine near the Canadian border. The incident began at approximately 2:30 p.m., just as Maria crested a hill that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding wilderness. She'd made this exact climb hundreds of times before, but something was different today. The landscape looked subtly wrong, as if someone had rearranged the mountains and valleys while she wasn't looking. Peaks that should have been on her left were now on her right, and valleys that she remembered as being deep and narrow had somehow become wide and shallow. Maria's first thought was that she'd taken a wrong turn somewhere, despite the fact that the top of the World Highway was essentially a single road with no significant branches or alternate routes. She checked her GPS unit, but the screen showed her position as a blinking dot floating in empty space, completely disconnected from any mapped roads or landmarks. More disturbing was her dashboard clock, which had stopped at exactly 2:30 p.m. despite the fact that she'd been driving for what felt like several hours since reaching the hilltop. The sun remained frozen in the same position in the sky, casting shadows that never moved despite the passage of time. Maria's fuel gauge also remained constant, never dropping despite the fact that her engine was running and consuming diesel at its normal rate. The CB radio in Maria's truck began picking up her own voice, broadcasting conversations she remembered having with other drivers on previous trips along this highway. But the conversations were playing out of sequence, mixing together encounters from different months and years in a confusing jumble of memories and experiences. "This is the eastbound Peterbilt at mile marker 45, Maria heard herself saying. "Road conditions are good, but watch out for caribou near the next valley." Maria grabbed her microphone and tried to respond to her own transmission, but her words came out of the radio speakers before she spoke them, creating an impossible conversation where effects preceded causes and responses came before questions. As she continued east toward the Canadian border, Maria began to notice that she was encountering the same landmarks repeatedly. A distinctive rock formation that looked like a giant's hand appeared on her right side. Then again 20 minutes later, then again after that. Each time she passed the rock formation, it was exactly 2:30 p.m. according to her clock, and her fuel gauge showed exactly the same level. Maria tried to break the cycle by taking different actions each time she reached the rock formation. On her second pass, she stopped her truck and got out to examine the strange stone structure up close. On her third pass, she tried turning around and driving back the way she'd come. On her fourth pass, she attempted to radio for help from the Alaska State Troopers. None of her actions made any difference. No matter what she did, she always found herself approaching the same hilltop at exactly 2:30 p.m., with her fuel gauge and odometer showing identical readings. It was as if the highway had become a loop that reset itself every time she completed a circuit, trapping her in a recursive journey that had no beginning and no end. The CB radio transmissions became more frequent and more confusing as the loops continued. Maria could hear dozens of versions of herself having conversations with other drivers, dispatchers, and family members, creating a cacophony of overlapping voices that made it impossible to distinguish between past, present, and future communications. "Maria, this is your dispatcher in Fairbanks," one voice said. "We've lost your GPS signal. What's your current location?" "I don't know," multiple versions of Maria's voice replied simultaneously. "I'm somewhere on the top of the world highway, but nothing looks right. The mountains have moved, and my clock stopped at 2:30. "That's impossible," the dispatcher's voice responded. "GPS satellites don't just stop working, and clocks don't freeze unless there's an electrical problem." But Maria could hear other conversations playing simultaneously, discussions about different loads she'd carried, different weather conditions she'd encountered, and different destinations she'd never actually visited. It was as if every possible version of every trip she might have made on the top of the world highway was broadcasting at the same time, creating a temporal traffic jam of parallel experiences. On her 15th pass by the rock formation, Maria noticed something that hadn't been there before. Another truck was parked beside the highway, a truck that looked exactly like hers in every detail. As she got closer, she could see someone in the driver's seat, a figure that looked exactly like herself. Maria pulled over behind her duplicate truck and got out to investigate. The other driver also got out, and Maria found herself face to face with an exact copy of herself, wearing the same clothes, carrying the same equipment, and speaking with her own voice. "How long have you been trapped here?" the other Maria asked. "I don't know," Maria replied. "My clock stopped at 2:30, and I keep passing the same landmarks over and over again." "Same here. I've been trying to find a way out for what feels like hours, but every road leads back to the same hilltop." The two Marias compared notes and discovered they were experiencing identical time loops, but with slight variations in the details. The other Maria had been carrying a different load to a different destination, but she'd become trapped at exactly the same time and location. They seemed to be parallel versions of the same journey, existing simultaneously in the same impossible space. As they talked, more trucks appeared on the highway, all of them identical to Maria's Peterbilt, all driven by identical versions of herself. Soon there were dozens of Maria Santoses standing beside the top of the world highway, all trapped in their own versions of the same temporal loop, all trying to figure out how to escape from a situation that defied every law of physics they understood. The conversation between multiple versions of herself became increasingly surreal as Maria tried to coordinate with her duplicates to find a solution to their predicament. Some of the other Marias had been trapped for what they believed to be days or weeks, while others had just arrived at the anomaly. But all of them shared the same experience of time stopping at 2:30 p.m. and the highway becoming a closed loop that had no exit. "I think we're caught in some kind of space-time distortion," one of the other Marias suggested. "Maybe the aurora borealis interacts with magnetic fields in the mountains and creates temporal anomalies under certain atmospheric conditions." "That's science fiction," another Maria replied. "Things like this don't happen in the real world." But as the multiple versions of herself debated the nature of their situation, Maria began to notice that the sky above them was changing. The aurora borealis, which normally wasn't visible during daylight hours, was beginning to manifest as faint green curtains that shimmered between the mountain peaks. The phenomenon was subtle at first, but it gradually became more pronounced, until the entire sky was alive with ethereal lights that seemed to pulse in rhythm with some cosmic heartbeat. That's when Maria realized what she had to do. Instead of trying to escape the loop by driving in different directions or taking different actions, she needed to synchronize her efforts with all the other versions of herself. If they were all part of the same temporal distortion, perhaps they could only escape by working together as a collective consciousness. Maria gathered all her duplicates and explained her theory. If they all got in their trucks and drove toward the Canadian border at exactly the same time, maintaining identical speeds and following identical routes, they might be able to break through the temporal barrier that was trapping them. The plan worked, but not in the way Maria had expected. As all the versions of herself began driving in perfect synchronization, the other trucks began to fade away one by one, until only Maria's original Peterbilt remained on the highway. The aurora borealis disappeared, her dashboard clock resumed ticking, and her GPS unit began showing her correct position once again. Maria completed her delivery to the mining camp and returned to Fairbanks without further incident, but she never forgot her experience on the top of the World Highway. She began researching temporal anomalies and discovered that similar incidents had been reported by drivers on other high-altitude highways around the world, usually during periods of intense aurora activity. The phenomenon remained unexplained by conventional science, but Maria learned to pay attention to aurora forecasts before making trips along the top of the World Highway. And whenever she sees those green lights beginning to shimmer between the mountain peaks, she makes sure to complete her journey as quickly as possible before the highway slips out of normal time and traps her once again in an endless loop of her own making. The Haines Highway connects the small coastal town of Haines to the Alaska Highway, winding through 151 miles of some of the most breathtaking and treacherous terrain in North America. The route passes through the heart of the Chilkat Mountains, across bridges that span roaring rivers, and along precipices where one moment of inattention can mean 1,000-foot fall into rocky canyons below. But among all the bridges that carry the Haines Highway across Alaska's wild rivers, one structure stands apart from all the others. Locals call it the Screaming Bridge, a seemingly ordinary steel and concrete span that crosses the Klehini River about 60 miles north of Haines. To most travelers, it looks no different from dozens of other highway bridges throughout the state. But truck drivers who've crossed it during certain conditions know that appearances can be deceiving, and that some structures hold memories that refuse to stay buried. Kevin Murphy had been running freight on the Haines Highway for 9 years when he first heard the bridge scream. It was November 2018, during a late-season storm that brought freezing rain and winds gusting up to 60 miles per hour. Kevin was northbound with a load of groceries and supplies for communities along the Alaska Highway, fighting to keep his Kenworth T800 on the road as ice accumulated on his windshield faster than his wipers could clear it. The Klehini River Bridge appeared in Kevin's headlights like a ghost materializing from the storm. The structure was 200 feet long and rose about 80 feet above the rushing water below, high enough that the sound of the river was usually inaudible to vehicles crossing overhead. But as Kevin approached the bridge, he could hear something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't the sound of wind through the steel superstructure, or the normal creaking and groaning of metal expanding and contracting in the cold. What Kevin heard was unmistakably human voices, dozens of them, all screaming in absolute terror and anguish. The screams seemed to be coming from the bridge itself, rising from the steel beams and concrete supports like the voices of souls trapped in some technological purgatory. Kevin slowed his truck to a crawl as he entered the bridge, trying to pinpoint the source of the horrific sounds. The screaming grew louder as he reached the center span, becoming so intense that Kevin had to cover his ears to keep from being overwhelmed by the cacophony of human suffering. But even with his hands pressed tightly against his head, the voices seemed to penetrate directly into his brain, filling his consciousness with images of pain and terror that weren't his own memories. Through the auditory assault, Kevin began to distinguish individual voices among the chaos. There were men, women, and children, all crying out for help that would never come. Some were calling for their families, others were praying in languages Kevin didn't recognize, and still others were simply screaming wordlessly as if the pain they were experiencing was too great for language to express. Kevin's CB radio crackled to life, and through the static came a voice that was calm and professional despite the supernatural chaos surrounding them. Northbound truck on the Klehini Bridge. This is Alaska State Trooper Unit 47. We're getting reports of a disturbance in your area. What's your status? Kevin grabbed his microphone with shaking hands. This is the northbound Kenworth. I'm on the bridge right now, and there's something seriously wrong here. I'm hearing voices, screams coming from the bridge structure itself. Copy that, Kenworth. Can you describe what you're experiencing? It sounds like dozens of people screaming for help, Trooper. The voices are coming from everywhere at once, like they're trapped inside the steel beams. I've never heard anything like it. There was a long pause before the trooper responded. Kenworth, I need you to exit the bridge as quickly and safely as possible. Do not stop, do not investigate, just get across and keep driving north. We'll meet you at the next rest area. Kevin accelerated, eager to escape the screaming bridge and reach solid ground on the far side. But as his truck approached the north end of the span, the voices suddenly became coherent, speaking in clear English that cut through the storm like razor blades through flesh. Help us, they pleaded. We're still here. We never left. The water is so cold, and we can't find our way to the surface. Don't leave us, another voice cried. We've been waiting so long for someone to hear us. Please, tell our families we're sorry we couldn't come home. Kevin realized with growing horror that the voices belonged to people who had died on or near the bridge, victims of accidents, suicides, or other tragedies that had claimed their lives in the rushing waters of the Klehini River below. Their spirits seemed to be trapped in the steel and concrete structure that had been the last thing they saw before death claimed them. As Kevin's truck cleared the bridge, the screaming stopped abruptly, leaving him alone with the normal sounds of wind and rain and diesel engine. The sudden silence was almost as disturbing as the voices had been, creating a vacuum that seemed to pull at Kevin's consciousness like a physical force. He drove to the designated rest area and waited for the state trooper to arrive, using the time to try to process what he'd experienced. Kevin had been driving truck for most of his adult life, and he'd encountered plenty of strange things on the road. But nothing had prepared him for the raw human anguish he'd heard coming from the Klehini River Bridge. Trooper Sarah Jensen arrived 20 minutes later, her patrol car sliding slightly on the ice-covered pavement as she pulled into the rest area. She was a veteran officer who'd patrolled the Haines Highway for 15 years, and Kevin could see in her eyes that she'd dealt with similar reports before. You're not the first driver to hear voices on that bridge, Trooper Jensen explained as they sat in her heated patrol car. We get reports maybe 3 or 4 times a year, usually during severe weather conditions when visibility is low and drivers are already on edge. Are you saying I was hallucinating? I'm not saying anything of the kind. I've heard the voices myself, twice in 15 years of patrolling this highway. Both times during bad storms, both times in the middle of the night when I was crossing the bridge alone. Trooper Jensen pulled out a thick file folder and showed Kevin newspaper clippings dating back to the 1940s, when the original bridge was constructed. The articles documented dozens of deaths associated with the Klehini River crossing over the decades. Construction workers who'd fallen during the bridge's construction, motorists who'd skidded off icy pavement and plunged into the water below, and individuals who'd deliberately jumped from the span in acts of desperation or despair. The current bridge was built in 1987, Trooper Jensen explained, but it sits on the same foundations as the original structure. Some people think the voices belong to everyone who's ever died at this crossing, going back to the early days when it was just a ferry landing and people drowned trying to cross the river on their own. The most disturbing entry in the file was a report from September 1994, when a family of 5 had driven off the bridge during a severe windstorm. Their car had been found 3 days later, submerged in 20 feet of water with all 5 occupants still inside. The recovery divers had reported hearing voices calling for help from inside the vehicle, even though all the victims had been dead for days. The Tlingit people who lived in this area before European settlement considered the Klehini River crossing to be a place where the boundary between the living world and the spirit world was thin. Trooper Jensen continued. They had ceremonies and rituals they performed before crossing, asking permission from the spirits and offering gifts to ensure safe passage. Kevin learned that the Alaska Department of Transportation had conducted multiple investigations of the bridge over the years, looking for structural flaws or acoustic phenomena that might explain the reports of voices. Engineers had found nothing wrong with the span itself, and acoustic experts had concluded that the bridge's design and location made it impossible for sounds from the river below to be amplified and transmitted to vehicles crossing overhead. But the reports continued, and experienced troopers like Jensen had learned to take them seriously. "We don't understand what causes it," she admitted, "but we know it's real. Drivers hear the voices, they get spooked, and sometimes they make poor decisions as a result. We've had vehicles go off the road right after crossing the bridge, usually because the driver was so shaken by what they'd experienced that they couldn't concentrate on driving safely." Kevin completed his delivery run and returned to Haines the following day, but he approached the Klehini River Bridge with considerable apprehension. This time, however, the crossing was uneventful. The weather was clear, the wind was calm, and the only sounds Kevin heard were the normal noises of truck tires on pavement and wind flowing over his trailer. But Kevin never forgot the voices he'd heard during that November storm, and he began to understand why some drivers changed their routes to avoid crossing the screaming bridge during severe weather. The human mind, he learned, wasn't equipped to process the concentrated anguish of decades worth of trauma and death, especially when that suffering had somehow become embedded in the steel and concrete of a highway bridge. Kevin continued running freight on the Haines Highway for several more years, but he modified his schedule to avoid crossing the Klehini River Bridge during storms or periods of low visibility. And whenever he does have to cross during dangerous conditions, he always said a brief prayer for the souls who were still trapped there, still calling out for help from their watery graves, still hoping that someone would hear their voices and remember their names. The Glen Highway connects Anchorage to the Richardson Highway, passing through 328 miles of wilderness that includes some of Alaska's most spectacular scenery and most dangerous driving conditions. The route crosses mountain passes where avalanches can bury entire vehicles, follows rivers that flood without warning, and traverses stretches of tundra where a mechanical breakdown can mean death by exposure in a matter of hours. For truck drivers hauling freight between Alaska's major population centers, the Glen Highway is both a vital transportation corridor and a constant test of skill, endurance, and survival instincts. Every mile demands respect, and every journey requires careful planning to ensure adequate fuel, supplies, and emergency equipment. But sometimes, even the most prepared drivers encounter situations that go beyond the realm of normal highway hazards. Lisa Chun had been running freight on the Glen Highway for 11 years when she discovered that not all fuel stops are located in the world of the living. It was December 2020, during a period when temperatures had dropped to 50 below zero and stayed there for 2 weeks straight. Lisa was hauling heating oil from Anchorage to a remote community near Glen Ellen, driving through a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet where nothing could survive. Lisa's Peterbilt 579 was equipped for extreme cold weather operation, but even the best equipment had its limitations when exposed to temperatures that made steel brittle and rubber crack like glass. She'd loaded extra diesel fuel additive to prevent her tanks from gelling, carried spare batteries in case her electrical system failed, and packed enough emergency supplies to survive for a week if her truck broke down in the wilderness. The incident began about 150 miles east of Anchorage, in a section of the Glen Highway that passed through the Chugach Mountains. Lisa had been driving for 6 hours straight, making good time despite road conditions that required constant attention and frequent speed adjustments. Her fuel gauge was approaching the quarter tank mark, which meant she needed to start looking for a place to refuel before continuing toward her destination. But there was a problem. The next scheduled fuel stop was still 40 miles ahead, and Lisa's fuel consumption had been higher than expected due to the extreme cold and challenging road conditions. She might make it to the next truck stop, but it would be cutting things uncomfortably close, especially if she encountered any delays or unexpected obstacles along the route. That's when Lisa saw the lights ahead. Through the blowing snow and ice crystals, she could make out the familiar glow of a truck stop. Bright overhead lighting, the distinctive shapes of fuel pumps, and the warm yellow illumination of a building where drivers could buy coffee, food, and supplies. Lisa checked her GPS unit, but the screen showed no truck stops in this location, just empty wilderness stretching for miles in every direction. Lisa slowed her truck and squinted through her windshield, trying to get a better look at the unexpected facility. The truck stop looked completely normal, with multiple diesel pumps, a convenience store, and even what appeared to be a restaurant attached to the main building. Several other trucks were parked in the lot, their exhaust stacks emitting steam clouds that indicated their engines were running to prevent them from freezing in the extreme cold. The GPS system insisted there was no truck stop at this location, but Lisa's fuel situation was becoming critical. She had to make a decision: trust her electronic navigation and risk running out of fuel before reaching the next confirmed truck stop, or trust her eyes and refuel at a facility that supposedly didn't exist. Lisa chose to trust her eyes. She pulled into the truck stop and parked beside one of the fuel pumps, relieved to have found salvation in the middle of Alaska's frozen wilderness. But as she got out of her cab and approached the pump, details became apparent that made her question what she was seeing. The other trucks in the lot were all vintage models, rigs that looked like they belonged in museums rather than on modern highways. Lisa saw a 1970s Peterbilt 359, a 1960s Kenworth W900, and even what looked like a 1950s white 3000, all in pristine condition despite their apparent age. The trucks were running, but they weren't making any noise, and their exhaust stacks weren't producing the thick clouds of steam she'd observed from a distance. The fuel pump itself looked normal, with the usual credit card readers and price displays, but the numbers on the price sign were frozen at amounts that hadn't been seen since the 1980s. Diesel fuel for 89 cents per gallon, regular gasoline for 67 cents. Lisa tried to use her commercial fuel card, but the reader kept displaying an error message that made no sense. Account not recognized. Please see time coordinator for assistance. Lisa walked toward the convenience store, hoping to find someone who could help her process payment for fuel. But as she approached the building, she realized that what she'd taken for warm yellow lighting was actually something else entirely. The windows weren't illuminated from inside, but rather seemed to be glowing with their own internal light, as if the glass itself was radiating energy. The door to the store was unlocked, but when Lisa tried to enter, she found herself stepping into an environment that defied physical laws. The interior of the building seemed to extend far beyond what should have been possible given the size of the structure she'd observed from outside. Aisles of merchandise stretched into the distance, disappearing into shadows that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The products on the shelves were familiar but wrong, brands and packages that looked like they belonged to different decades or alternate versions of reality. Lisa saw candy bars with names she didn't recognize, soft drinks in bottles that had never been manufactured, and magazines with headlines about events that had never happened. Behind the counter stood a man who appeared to be in his 60s, wearing a uniform that looked like it belonged to a truck stop from the 1970s. His name tag read Frank, and he smiled at Lisa with the practiced friendliness of someone who'd been serving customers for decades. "Evening, miss," Frank said. "Cold one tonight, isn't it? What can I do for you?" "I need to fuel up," Lisa replied. "But your pump isn't recognizing my fuel card." "Fuel cards?" Frank laughed. "We don't take those newfangled things here. Cash only, same as always." Lisa checked her wallet and found she had about $60 in cash, enough to buy maybe 30 gallons of fuel at current prices. But at the prices displayed on Frank's pumps, she could fill both her tanks and still have money left over. "How much for a complete fill-up?" Lisa asked. Frank consulted a handwritten chart behind the counter. "Looks like you're running a Peterbilt with twin 150-gallon tanks. At today's prices, that'll be $267.50 for a complete fill-up." The math didn't work. At 89 cents per gallon, 300 gallons should have cost $267, not $267.50. But Lisa was too grateful to have found fuel to worry about 50 cents in discrepancy. She handed Frank her cash and watched him count it carefully, as if he was handling currency from a foreign country. "This isn't enough," Frank said apologetically. "This is some kind of play money, isn't it? The colors are all wrong, and the pictures don't match what I'm used to seeing." Lisa looked at her money more carefully and realized that Frank was right. The bills in her wallet appeared to be genuine US currency, but subtle details were wrong. The portraits were of presidents she didn't recognize, the colors were slightly off, and the dates were from years that didn't exist in any timeline she was familiar with. "I'm sorry," Lisa said, "but this is all the cash I have. Maybe I could use a credit card." "Credit cards?" Frank looked confused. "What's a credit card?" Lisa tried to explain the concept of electronic payment systems, but Frank listened with the expression of someone hearing about technology from science fiction. According to him, the year was 1987, and the most advanced payment method available was a paper check drawn on a local bank. "Look," Frank said kindly, "you seem like good people, and I can see you're in a tough spot. Tell you what I'll do. You can fuel up now, and you can pay me back the next time you come through. I'll just put it on your tab." Frank opened a ledger book and wrote Lisa's name and truck information on a page that already contained dozens of similar entries. Lisa noticed that some of the names in the book were dated months or even years in the past, suggesting that Frank had been extending credit to stranded drivers for a very long time. Lisa fueled her truck, grateful for Frank's generosity but puzzled by the entire situation. The diesel flowed normally from the pump, and her fuel gauge showed that her tanks were indeed being filled. But the fuel itself looked strange, with an oily rainbow sheen that she'd never seen before, and it smelled different from the low-sulfur diesel that was mandated for all highway vehicles. As Lisa prepared to leave the Phantom truck stop, Frank walked out to see her off. "Drive safe out there," he said. "These roads can be dangerous, especially for folks who aren't familiar with local conditions." "How long have you been operating this truck stop?" Lisa asked. Frank scratched his head and thought for a moment. "Must be going on 30 years now. Started right after I got out of the Army. Figured truckers needed a place to stop and rest between Anchorage and Glen Ellen, so I built this place to serve them." Lisa wanted to tell Frank that according to her GPS, there was no truck stop at this location, and that modern maps showed nothing but wilderness for 50 miles in every direction. But she was running behind schedule, and her heating oil needed to be delivered before her customers' tanks ran dry. Lisa thanked Frank for his hospitality and drove back onto the Glen Highway. In her mirrors, she could see the lights of the truck stop growing smaller and fainter until they disappeared entirely into the blowing snow. When she checked her GPS again, it showed her position as being in the middle of empty wilderness, with no services available for 40 miles in any direction. The fuel Frank had sold her performed normally, carrying Lisa to her destination without any problems. But when she tried to calculate her fuel consumption for the trip, the numbers didn't make sense. According to her records, she should have run out of fuel long before reaching Glen Allen, even accounting for the phantom refueling stop. It was as if Frank's diesel contained more energy than normal fuel, or had somehow extended her range beyond what physics should have allowed. Lisa never saw Frank's truck stop again, despite traveling the Glen Highway regularly for the next several years. She asked other drivers if they'd ever encountered a fuel stop in that location, but none of them knew what she was talking about. The Alaska Department of Transportation had no records of any commercial facilities being licensed for that section of highway, and satellite imagery showed nothing but forest and tundra. But sometimes, during the worst winter storms when temperatures drop below 40 degrees below zero and fuel consumption increases dramatically, Lisa finds herself hoping that Frank's phantom truck stop will appear in her headlights once again, offering fuel and shelter to drivers who are running out of options in Alaska's unforgiving wilderness. The Talk Cutoff connects the Alaska Highway to the Richardson Highway across 125 miles of wilderness that epitomizes everything dangerous about driving in Alaska's interior. The road passes through territory where winter temperatures regularly drop below 60 degrees below zero, where sudden weather changes can transform clear highways into death traps within minutes, and where the aurora borealis creates electromagnetic disturbances that can interfere with navigation equipment in ways that science still doesn't fully understand. For truck drivers, the Talk Cutoff represents one of Alaska's most challenging routes, a stretch of highway that demands constant vigilance and flawless decision-making. There are no second chances on this remote road, no margin for error when dealing with black ice, crosswinds, and visibility that can drop to zero without warning. But even the most experienced drivers aren't prepared for the supernatural phenomena that occasionally manifest along this desolate highway. Encounters that suggest reality itself becomes unstable in Alaska's most isolated regions. Angela Rodriguez had been running freight on the Talk Cutoff for 13 years when she encountered something that fundamentally altered her understanding of what was possible on Alaska's highways. It was January 2024, during a period when the aurora borealis had been unusually active, creating spectacular light displays that were visible even during daylight hours. Angela was hauling construction materials from Fairbanks to a mining operation near the Canadian border, making what should have been a routine overnight run through familiar territory. Angela drove a customized Volvo VNL 860 that she'd purchased new and modified specifically for Alaska's extreme conditions. The truck was equipped with every safety feature and cold weather option available, from auxiliary heating systems to emergency communication equipment that could function even when cellular networks were down. Angela was known throughout the trucking community as someone who never took unnecessary risks, a professional who'd built her reputation on safe, reliable service in conditions that would challenge even the most experienced drivers. The incident began about 50 miles east of Fairbanks, in a section of the Talk Cutoff that passed through dense forest broken by occasional clearings where the northern lights were clearly visible. Angela was making good time despite temperatures that had dropped to 52 degrees below zero, cold enough to make steel brittle and rubber crack like glass. Her truck was running smoothly, all systems functioning normally, and her fuel consumption was tracking exactly where it should be for these conditions. That's when Angela noticed the headlights in her mirrors. At first, she assumed it was another truck running the same route, perhaps a driver she knew making a similar delivery to one of the remote communities scattered throughout Alaska's interior. But as Angela watched the approaching headlights, she realized something was wrong with the picture she was seeing. The other truck was matching her speed exactly, maintaining a constant distance that never varied regardless of how Angela adjusted her own velocity. More disturbing was the fact that the approaching truck looked exactly like her own Volvo. In her side mirrors, Angela could see the distinctive profile of a VNL 860, complete with the same custom paint scheme and the same configuration of running lights that she'd installed on her own rig. It was as if she was being followed by a perfect duplicate of her own truck, driven by someone who knew her equipment and her driving habits intimately. Angela tried adjusting her speed to get a better look at the mystery driver, but every time she slowed down or accelerated, the other truck matched her movements with supernatural precision. When Angela signaled for a lane change, the phantom truck signaled as well. When Angela adjusted her mirrors, she could see the other driver making identical adjustments to their own mirrors. The CB radio crackled to life, and Angela heard her own voice coming through the speakers. Eastbound Volvo at mile marker 62. This is the westbound Volvo. You got your ears on. Angela grabbed her microphone, but before she could respond, she heard another version of her own voice answer. Yeah, I got you. Road conditions looking good ahead. Smooth and clear. Watch out for some black ice near the next bridge, but nothing too serious. Angela was listening to a conversation between two versions of herself, discussing road conditions and hazards with the casual familiarity of drivers who'd traveled this route countless times. But Angela wasn't transmitting anything, and she was traveling eastbound, not westbound as one of the voices had claimed. Confused and increasingly disturbed, Angela tried to break into the conversation. This is the eastbound Volvo. Who am I talking to? Both versions of her own voice responded simultaneously. This is Angela Rodriguez, running freight to the Pogo mine. Who's asking? I'm Angela Rodriguez, Angela replied, her voice shaking slightly. And I'm running freight to the Pogo mine. There was a long pause before one of the voices responded. That's impossible. I'm Angela Rodriguez, and there's only one of me. Angela realized she was having a three-way conversation with multiple versions of herself, each one convinced that they were the real Angela Rodriguez and that the others were somehow imposters. The situation was becoming increasingly surreal, especially when Angela looked in her mirrors and saw that there were now 3 identical Volvo trucks following her down the talk cutoff, all maintaining perfect formation despite the icy road conditions. The CB radio chatter intensified as more versions of Angela's voice joined the conversation. Soon there were 6 different Angela Rodriguezes discussing their respective loads, destinations, and experiences on the talk cutoff. Some were describing trips Angela remembered making months or years earlier, while others were talking about deliveries to locations she'd never visited and cargo she'd never hauled. One version of Angela was discussing a load of pipeline equipment destined for Prudhoe Bay, a run that the real Angela had never made. Another was describing winter conditions from 2019, speaking as if that year's brutal cold snap was happening in the present moment. A third Angela was talking about mechanical problems with her truck that the real Angela had never experienced. As the convoy of identical trucks continued east along the talk cutoff, Angela began to notice that the landscape outside her windows was changing in subtle but impossible ways. The familiar markers and reference points she'd used to navigate this route for 13 years were shifting positions, appearing in locations where they'd never been before. Mile markers were displaying numbers that didn't correspond to any numbering system she recognized. Most disturbing of all, Angela could see multiple versions of herself in the cabs of the phantom trucks. Some were wearing different clothes, others had different hairstyles, and a few appeared to be several years older or younger than Angela's actual age. It was as if she was looking at alternate versions of herself from parallel timelines where her life had taken different paths. The aurora borealis was intensifying overhead, creating curtains of green and purple light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the CB radio transmissions. Angela had driven under the northern lights hundreds of times before, but tonight the phenomenon seemed more active and more focused than she'd ever witnessed. The electromagnetic effects were so strong that her compass was spinning randomly and her GPS unit was displaying readings that placed her in multiple locations simultaneously. One of the other Angelas began describing an encounter with something called the mirror convoy. a phenomenon that supposedly occurred along the talk cutoff when atmospheric conditions were just right and the aurora borealis reached a certain level of intensity. According to this alternate version of herself, drivers occasionally became trapped in temporal loops where multiple versions of their own journeys played out simultaneously, creating convoys of identical trucks carrying identical drivers along the same stretch of highway. "It happened to me 3 years ago," the other Angela explained over the CB radio. "I was running a load of mining equipment to the same destination you're heading for now. The aurora was active just like tonight, and suddenly I found myself surrounded by trucks that looked exactly like mine. I counted 12 of them before I figured out how to break free." "How did you get out?" the real Angela asked. "You have to stop following yourself. As long as you maintain the same speed and direction as your duplicates, you'll stay trapped in the loop. But if you can force yourself to break formation, to make a choice that your other selves don't make, you can escape back to normal reality." Angela understood the theory, but putting it into practice was more difficult than it sounded. Every instinct she had as a professional driver was telling her to maintain her current course and speed, to avoid taking unnecessary risks on a highway where a single mistake could be fatal. But the longer she stayed in formation with her phantom duplicates, the more she could feel herself becoming part of the mirror convoy, losing her individual identity to the collective consciousness of multiple Angela Rodriguez's. The CB radio transmissions were becoming more frequent and more confusing as additional versions of Angela joined the conversation. Some were describing experiences from her actual past, while others were discussing events that had never happened in her timeline. The cacophony of overlapping voices was making it difficult for Angela to distinguish between her own thoughts and the mental chatter of her alternate selves. That's when Angela noticed that one of the phantom trucks was beginning to fade, becoming more translucent with each passing mile. The corresponding voice on the CB radio was growing fainter as well, speaking in tones that suggested the driver was moving away from the convoy and returning to whatever dimension she'd originated from. "I'm breaking free," the fading Angela announced. "I can see the regular highway markers again. The other trucks are disappearing." Angela realized that her alternate self had successfully escaped the mirror convoy by making a decision that the other versions of herself hadn't made. But what choice had broken the temporal loop? What action had been different enough to restore normal reality for that particular Angela Rodriguez? As Angela pondered the question, she noticed that her fuel gauge was behaving strangely, fluctuating between different readings as if it couldn't decide how much diesel was actually in her tanks. Some readings suggested she was nearly full, while others indicated she was running dangerously low. It was as if the fuel levels from multiple versions of her journey were being averaged together by whatever force was maintaining the mirror convoy. Angela made her decision. Instead of continuing east toward her designated destination, she took the next exit ramp, leaving the talk cutoff and heading south on a secondary road that led toward a small community she'd never visited before. It was a choice that none of her alternate selves would make, a deviation from the planned route that would break her connection to the convoy of phantom trucks. The moment Angela's truck left the main highway, the other vehicles vanished completely. The CB radio fell silent, her GPS unit began displaying coherent readings again, and the aurora borealis returned to normal levels of activity. Angela found herself alone on a dark country road, with no trace of the supernatural convoy that had surrounded her for the past hour. Angela spent the night in the small community, waiting for daylight before returning to the talk cutoff to continue her journey to the mining operation. When she resumed her trip the following morning, the highway looked completely normal, with familiar landmarks in their proper locations and mile markers displaying the correct sequence of numbers. But Angela's CB radio continued to pick up occasional transmissions from other versions of herself, faint voices discussing trips she'd never made and describing experiences that had never happened in her timeline. The mirror convoy had released her, but it hadn't completely severed her connection to the alternate realities where other Angela Rodriguez's continued their journeys through parallel versions of Alaska's wilderness. Angela completed her delivery and returned to Fairbanks without further incident, but she never forgot her encounter with the Mirror Convoy. She began researching electromagnetic phenomena and discovered that scientists had documented unusual effects in areas where the aurora borealis was particularly active, including reports of electronic equipment malfunctioning in ways that seemed to violate known laws of physics. Some researchers theorized that the intense electromagnetic fields generated by aurora activity could create temporary distortions in space-time, allowing parallel realities to overlap and interact in ways that normally weren't possible. The theory was largely dismissed by mainstream science, but it provided a possible explanation for the experiences reported by drivers along Alaska's most remote highways. Angela continued running freight on the talk cutoff, but she paid close attention to aurora forecasts and avoided traveling during periods of intense electromagnetic activity. And whenever she heard her own voice on the CB radio discussing trips she didn't remember making, she knew that somewhere in the maze of parallel realities, other versions of herself were still driving Alaska's highways, still delivering cargo to destinations that existed only in alternate timelines. The Copper River Highway represents one of Alaska's most ambitious and ultimately tragic transportation projects, a road that was intended to connect the remote community of Cordova to the state's interior highway system. Construction began in the 1960s with great optimism, but the project was eventually abandoned after years of struggle against impossible terrain, extreme weather, and geological instability that made permanent road construction virtually impossible. Today, only 48 miles of the Copper River Highway actually exist, ending abruptly at the $1 Million Bridge where massive steel spans cross the Copper River before disappearing into wilderness that has reclaimed most of the original roadbed. The highway serves primarily as access to remote fishing areas and mining claims, but it's also become something of a legend among Alaska's truck drivers, who tell stories about stretches of road that exist only under certain conditions and lead to destinations that shouldn't be possible to reach. Derek Walsh had been hauling equipment and supplies to remote locations throughout Alaska for 16 years, when he discovered that some roads don't follow the normal rules of geography or physics. It was August 2023, during a brief window when weather conditions made it possible to attempt delivery to an extremely remote mining operation that was accessible only by the remnants of old construction roads that had been abandoned when the Copper River Highway project was canceled. Derek drove a heavy-duty International HX 520 equipped for off-road operation, with oversized tires, reinforced suspension, and enough ground clearance to navigate rough terrain that would destroy most commercial vehicles. He'd built his reputation on completing deliveries to locations that other drivers considered impossible to reach, using old mining roads, winter trails, and sometimes no roads at all to get equipment and supplies to customers who had no other options. The mining operation that had hired Derek was located somewhere beyond the end of the official highway, in territory that could only be reached by following GPS coordinates and hoping that decades-old maps were still accurate. The company needed specialized drilling equipment delivered before the brief summer season ended, and weather conditions made access impossible until the following year. Derek's load consisted of a portable drilling rig, fuel pumps, and other equipment that weighed nearly 40,000 pounds. It was a challenging cargo for a difficult route, but Derek had handled similar deliveries before and was confident in his ability to navigate whatever obstacles the abandoned highway might present. The journey began normally enough. Derek followed the Copper River Highway through familiar territory, passing fishing camps and day-use areas that were popular with tourists during the brief summer season. The pavement was in decent condition for the first 30 miles, requiring only minor adjustments for potholes and frost damage that had accumulated over years of minimal maintenance. But as Derek approached the end of the official highway, things began to change in ways that defied rational explanation. According to his GPS unit, he should have reached the terminus of the road at the $1 Million Bridge, where travelers normally had to turn around and head back toward Cordova. Instead, Derek found himself on a continuation of the highway that extended far beyond where any road should have existed. The pavement quality actually improved as he traveled farther from civilization, transforming from the cracked and weathered asphalt of the existing highway to smooth, fresh blacktop that looked like it had been laid within the past year. Mile markers appeared beside the road, but they were counting backward rather than forward, displaying numbers that decreased with each mile Derek traveled away from Cordova. Derek's first thought was that someone had completed construction on the abandoned highway project, perhaps as part of a mining development that hadn't been publicized. But the construction quality was too perfect, too advanced for what should have been a remote industrial access road. The highway featured engineering solutions that seemed decades ahead of current technology, with bridges that spanned impossible distances and road cuts through mountainous terrain that would have required massive earth-moving operations. More puzzling was the complete absence of construction equipment, work crews, or any other evidence that major highway construction had taken place in this remote location. The road appeared to have materialized fully formed, complete with guardrails, drainage systems, and signage that looked like it had been installed by highway departments that possessed resources far beyond what Alaska's limited budget could support. Derek's CB radio began picking up traffic reports and road condition updates that seemed to be discussing the highway he was currently traveling, but the information didn't match what he was experiencing. According to the radio chatter, the Copper River Highway was experiencing heavy congestion due to construction delays, multiple vehicle accidents, and weather-related closures that were causing major disruptions to commercial traffic. But Derek was the only vehicle on the road. In 3 hours of driving on the mysterious highway extension, he hadn't encountered a single other vehicle, construction worker, or sign of human activity. The radio reports were describing traffic conditions on a busy commercial highway, while Derek was traveling through wilderness so remote that he couldn't even get a cellular signal on his emergency phone. As Derek continued deeper into territory that shouldn't have been accessible by highway, the mile markers began displaying increasingly impossible numbers. He passed mile -15, then mile -23, then mile -37, as if he was traveling backward through some parallel version of the highway system where normal distance measurements didn't apply. The landscape outside Derek's windows was changing as well, transforming from the familiar forests and mountains of coastal Alaska into terrain that looked like it belonged on a different continent entirely. Derek saw rock formations that resembled red sandstone mesas from the American Southwest, vegetation that looked tropical despite the subarctic latitude, and weather patterns that seemed to shift between different climatic zones within the span of minutes. Most disturbing of all, Derek began to notice that his truck's odometer was running backward, subtracting miles from his total accumulated mileage rather than adding them. According to the instrument display, his International HX 520 was somehow losing the miles he'd driven over 16 years of professional trucking, as if the mysterious highway was erasing his entire driving history 1 mile at a time. Derek tried to turn around and head back toward familiar territory, but every time he attempted to reverse direction, he found himself continuing forward on the same impossible highway. The road seemed to have only one direction, leading deeper into wilderness that existed according to rules that had nothing to do with conventional geography. The CB radio chatter intensified as Derek traveled farther into the backwards mile system. He began hearing traffic reports from highways that had never been built, construction updates for projects that had been canceled decades ago, and weather advisories for regions that didn't exist on any map. The radio was somehow picking up transmissions from alternate versions of Alaska where different development decisions had been made and different highways had been constructed. One particularly disturbing transmission described a massive traffic accident on the Copper River Highway involving dozens of vehicles and requiring multiple emergency response teams. The accident was supposedly occurring at mile -47, exactly the location Derek was approaching according to the backward mile markers beside the road. But when Derek reached mile -47, he found no evidence of any accident. The highway was clear and undamaged, with no debris, skid marks, or emergency vehicles. Yet his CB radio continued broadcasting detailed reports about the ongoing rescue operation, describing casualties and road closures that clearly weren't happening in Derek's version of reality. Derek began to suspect that he'd somehow become disconnected from normal reality, traveling on a version of the Copper River Highway that existed in some parallel dimension where the original construction project had been completed according to different specifications. The backward mile markers suggested that he was moving through space and time in ways that violated fundamental laws of physics, traveling deeper into a realm where cause and effect operated according to alien principles. As Derek passed mile -60, his fuel gauge began behaving erratically, sometimes showing a full tank and sometimes indicating that he was nearly empty. His engine temperature fluctuated wildly despite steady operating conditions, and his transmission seemed to shift randomly between gears without any input from Derek. The truck was responding to conditions in multiple realities simultaneously, trying to adapt to different versions of the same journey. The radio traffic became increasingly chaotic as Derek traveled deeper into negative mile territory. He heard reports of highway construction projects that had been completed decades before their scheduled start dates, weather events that were occurring in reverse chronological order, and traffic accidents where the effects preceded the causes. Derek realized that he was experiencing time in reverse along with the backward mile markers. Every mile he traveled was taking him further into the past, to a version of Alaska where the Copper River Highway had been completed but where history itself was running in the wrong direction. At mile -89, Derek encountered something that nearly caused him to lose control of his truck. Standing beside the highway was a construction worker in vintage safety gear, waving a flag to direct traffic around what appeared to be a road construction zone. But the construction work was happening in reverse, with heavy equipment removing asphalt and demolishing bridges that had just been completed. Derek stopped his truck and approached the construction worker, hoping to get some explanation for what he was experiencing. The worker was friendly and professional, but his responses to Derek's questions were deeply disturbing. "We're deconstructing the highway," the worker explained, "taking it back to the way it was before the project started. Should have the whole thing removed by next winter." "But why would you tear down a perfectly good highway?" Derek asked. "Orders from the state," the worker replied. "They decided the project was too expensive and too dangerous to maintain. Better to remove it completely than to leave it as a liability." Derek realized that he was witnessing the Copper River Highway project being undone, watching construction equipment systematically removing every trace of the road that he'd just been driving on. The backward mile system was taking him through a reverse timeline where the highway was being deconstructed in the opposite order from which it had been built. As Derek watched the destruction work proceed, his truck began to fade, becoming more transparent with each passing moment. He realized that he was disappearing along with the highway, being erased from existence as the construction project was reversed and the road he'd been traveling on ceased to exist. Derek ran back to his truck and threw it into reverse, hoping to escape the destruction zone before he was completely erased from reality. But driving backward on the backward highway created a double negative that restored normal forward motion, carrying Derek away from the construction zone and back toward positive mile markers. As Derek reached mile 0, the mysterious highway extension vanished completely, leaving him at the familiar terminus of the real Copper River Highway near the $1 Million Bridge. His truck had returned to normal operation, his odometer was counting forward again, and his CB radio was picking up only the usual sparse chatter from other drivers in the area. Derek never completed his delivery to the remote mining operation because, according to his GPS unit, no such operation existed in the location specified by his original contract. The coordinates led to empty wilderness that showed no signs of mining activity or industrial development. When Derek investigated further, he discovered that the mining company that had hired him had gone out of business in 1987, decades before he'd received the contract. Somehow, he'd been hired to make a delivery to a company that no longer existed, carrying equipment to a location that had never been developed, traveling on a highway that had never been completed. Derek continues to drive Alaska's highways, but he's never again attempted to travel beyond the official terminus of the Copper River Highway. And whenever he passes mile marker 1 on any Alaska highway, he checks to make sure the numbers are counting in the right direction, because he's learned that some roads lead backward through time to destinations that exist only in the history of what might have been. The Denali Highway stretches 135 miles between Paxson and Cantwell, crossing some of the most remote and spectacular terrain in North America. Originally built as the primary access route to Denali National Park, the highway has largely been bypassed by more modern roads, leaving it as a lonely ribbon of gravel and pavement that attracts only the most adventurous travelers and the truck drivers who serve Alaska's most isolated communities. The Denali Highway is officially closed during winter months, but determined drivers with the right equipment can sometimes negotiate special permits to haul emergency supplies to communities that would otherwise be completely cut off from the outside world. These winter runs are dangerous beyond description, crossing terrain where a breakdown or navigational error can mean death within hours, and where rescue teams might not be able to reach stranded travelers for days or weeks. Robert Big Mike Thompson had been making emergency runs on the closed Denali Highway for 8 years when he encountered something that changed his understanding of what was possible in Alaska's wilderness. It was March 2023, during one of the worst late-season blizzards in recent memory, when Big Mike was contracted to deliver medical supplies to a remote village whose normal supply routes had been cut by avalanches and flooding. Big Mike was their only hope, and he knew it. He loaded his truck with the medical supplies and set out on the Denali Highway despite weather conditions that would have deterred most pilots from attempting flight. Visibility was near zero, winds were gusting up to 70 miles per hour, and the temperature was holding steady at 48 degrees below zero. But Big Mike had driven in worse conditions, and he knew that people's lives depended on his ability to complete this delivery. The first 100 miles of the journey passed without major incident, although Big Mike had to stop several times to clear ice from his windshield and check his route using GPS waypoints he'd programmed from previous trips. The Denali Highway was completely buried under fresh snow, making it impossible to distinguish the road from the surrounding tundra, but Big Mike's GPS unit kept him oriented and moving in the right direction. The trouble began about 20 miles from his destination, in a section of the highway that passed through a valley between two low mountain ridges. Big Mike's GPS signal began to fluctuate, losing satellite contact for minutes at a time before reconnecting with readings that didn't match his previous position data. His compass started spinning randomly, as if some local magnetic field was interfering with its normal operation. Most disturbing of all, Big Mike began to see lights in his peripheral vision, flickering movements that seemed to pace his truck through the blowing snow. At first, he assumed he was seeing reflections from his own headlights bouncing off ice crystals in the air, a common optical illusion during severe blizzards. But the lights were too organized, too purposeful in their movements to be random reflections. As Big Mike rounded a curve in the buried highway, his headlights illuminated something that made him slam on his brakes and bring his truck to a sliding stop. Standing in the middle of the road, directly in his path, was a figure wearing what looked like early 20th century Arctic gear. Heavy wool coat, fur hat, and boots that appeared to be made from animal hide. The figure was waving frantically, as if trying to flag down Big Mike's truck. Big Mike grabbed his spotlight and directed it toward the figure, trying to get a better look at the person who had appeared in the middle of one of Alaska's most remote highways during a blizzard that should have made human survival impossible. What he saw in the spotlight beam made his blood turn to slush. The figure was translucent, clearly visible but somehow insubstantial, as if Big Mike was looking at a projection or hologram rather than a living person. Worse yet, the figure's face showed signs of severe frostbite, with blackened skin and ice crystals coating his beard and eyebrows. This was someone who had died from exposure to extreme cold, but who was somehow still moving and trying to communicate. Big Mike's CB radio crackled to life, and through the static came a voice speaking in the flat accent of someone who'd lived his entire life in Alaska's wilderness. "Turn back, driver. The road ahead is blocked. You can't get through." Big Mike keyed his microphone. "Who is this? Where are you transmitting from?" "I'm standing right in front of your truck. Can't you see me?" Big Mike looked at the ghostly figure again and realized that its mouth was moving in synchronization with the voice on his radio. Somehow, the dead man was communicating through his CB system, using technology that hadn't existed when his clothing suggested he'd lived and died. "What's your name?" Big Mike asked. "Sam Mackenzie. I was trying to get supplies to Nikolai during the winter of 1934, but I got caught in a blizzard just like this one. My truck broke down and I tried to walk the rest of the way. Never made it." Big Mike felt ice water flowing through his veins. Sam Mackenzie was describing the exact same mission Big Mike was currently attempting, a supply run to the same isolated community under nearly identical weather conditions. The ghostly figure was someone who had died trying to complete the same delivery that Big Mike was now undertaking. "The avalanche zone ahead is unstable," Sam's voice continued through the radio. "The snow load on the ridges is too heavy, and the wind is creating pressure differentials that will trigger massive slides. If you continue on this route, you'll be buried under thousands of tons of snow and ice." Big Mike checked his topographic maps and realized that Sam was right. The valley ahead narrowed into a canyon where steep slopes on both sides created perfect conditions for avalanches. In his determination to complete the delivery, Big Mike had been focusing on forward progress and hadn't properly assessed the terrain hazards that lay ahead. "Is there another way to reach Nikolai?" Big Mike asked. Sam's ghostly figure pointed toward the east, indicating a route that would take Big Mike away from the main highway and across terrain that wasn't marked on any of his maps. "There's an old mining road that follows the ridgeline. It's longer and more dangerous, but it avoids the avalanche zones. I would have taken that route if I'd known about it before my truck failed." Big Mike hesitated. Following unmarked routes in blizzard conditions was incredibly dangerous, and his GPS system wouldn't be able to provide guidance on roads that didn't exist in its database. But staying on the main highway meant almost certain death in an avalanche, and turning back meant abandoning people who desperately needed the medical supplies he was carrying. "I'll guide you," Sam's voice offered. "I've been wandering these mountains for almost 90 years, and I know every trail and every dangerous spot. Let me help you complete the delivery I never could." Big Mike made his decision. He put his truck in gear and began following Sam Mackenzie's ghostly figure as it moved off the main highway and onto what appeared to be empty tundra. But as his headlights illuminated the ground ahead, Big Mike could see faint traces of an old road, barely visible ruts that had been carved decades ago by vehicles that had long since rusted away. The alternate route was treacherous, winding along narrow ridges where one wrong turn would send Big Mike's truck tumbling into ravines hundreds of feet deep. But Sam's guidance was precise and reliable, leading Big Mike around obstacles and warning him about dangerous sections where extra caution was required. As they traveled the Phantom Road, Sam told Big Mike about his own failed supply run in 1934. He'd been driving a 1932 Ford truck loaded with medicine and food for Nikolai's residents, who had been cut off by early winter storms that had persisted for weeks. Sam had made it to within 5 miles of the village before his truck broke down, and he'd attempted to carry the most critical supplies the rest of the way on foot. "I almost made it," Sam's voice said sadly. "I could see the lights of the village through the snow when the cold finally got to me. I sat down to rest, just for a minute, and I never got back up." They found my body the next spring, still clutching a bag of medicine I was trying to deliver. Big Mike realized that he was retracing the final steps of Sam Mackenzie's journey, following the same route and carrying supplies for the same community that Sam had died trying to reach. The ghostly guide was living vicariously through Big Mike's mission, finally completing the delivery that had cost him his life almost 90 years earlier. The alternate route eventually reconnected with the main highway about 2 miles from Nikolai, in an area where the terrain was stable and avalanche risk was minimal. As Big Mike's truck reached the village limits, Sam's ghostly figure began to fade, becoming more translucent with each passing moment. "Thank you," Sam's voice whispered through the CB radio. "You finished what I started. The people of Nikolai will get their medicine because you were brave enough to trust a dead man's directions." "Thank you for guiding me," Big Mike replied. "I couldn't have made it without your help." "Maybe now I can finally rest," Sam said. "I've been waiting so long to complete that delivery. Now I can move on." Sam Mackenzie's ghost disappeared completely as Big Mike drove into Nikolai and delivered the medical supplies that saved 3 lives that night. The village residents were amazed that anyone had managed to navigate the treacherous mountain roads during such severe weather conditions. But Big Mike never told them about his supernatural guide. Big Mike continued making emergency runs on the Denali Highway for several more years, but he never encountered Sam Mackenzie's ghost again. The old mining road that Sam had shown him wasn't visible on subsequent trips, as if it had existed only during that one blizzard-swept night when 2 supply runs separated by 90 years had somehow intersected in the endless wilderness of Alaska. But Big Mike never forgot the lesson Sam Mackenzie had taught him. Sometimes the dead refuse to rest until they've completed their final mission, and sometimes the living need guidance from those who've already paid the ultimate price for traveling Alaska's most dangerous roads. The long Alaskan night stretches endlessly ahead, filled with mysteries that defy explanation and encounters that challenge everything we think we know about the boundary between the living world and whatever lies beyond. These 10 stories represent just a small sample of the supernatural experiences reported by truck drivers who brave Alaska's most remote highways. Men and women who've learned that some roads lead to destinations that don't appear on any map. But our journey into the darkness is far from over. The isolation and extreme conditions that make Alaska's highways so dangerous also create the perfect environment for encounters with forces that exist beyond human understanding. And if these stories of haunted highways and phantom trucks have left you hungry for more tales from the edge of reality, then you won't want to miss our next expedition into the world of supernatural workplace encounters. Join us next time as we venture into an even more terrifying realm of occupational horror with 15 real rig oil worker horror stories. We'll descend into the depths of offshore drilling platforms and remote oil fields, where workers face not only the physical dangers of one of the world's most hazardous industries, but also supernatural threats that emerge from the Earth's deepest places. From ghostly apparitions in abandoned drilling sites to ancient entities awakened by industrial intrusion into their primordial domains, these stories will take you into work environments where the normal rules of reality simply don't apply. The darkness is calling, and there are always more stories waiting to be told from the places where ordinary people encounter the extraordinary horrors that lurk just beyond the edge of human perception.